Good afternoon to all of the participants that are joining us on this session on the second last day of the 2021 World Water Week, which is not in Stockholm, of course, being held virtually. We welcome all of you to this session, which is around improving the livelihoods of the poor to build climate change resilience. And this session is co-convened between CRIDF, Resilient Waters, SIWI, OCOCOM, and ZAMCOM. And that's an interesting mixture of different partners that are working on policy issues, partners that are also working across different basins, different catchments, representing governments. And they all have in common, of course, the various activities that are needed to make sure that you can build resilience to climate change at basin scale. It's interesting to note that next year sees the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Environment Conference, which first took place in 1972, and which is popularly said to have been the launch of the environmental movement globally. And a point that came out of there in this opening address made by the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, she commented saying that the greatest environmental threat we face today is poverty. And she linked these two so explicitly. So it's really fitting that we are looking at this session, looking at issues about how do you build that climate change resilience on the ground in those communities that need it the most. Right now, I draw your attention to a poll that's on the Pathable platform. So if you go out of your Zoom viewer and you take a look at Pathable, and you'll see there's a tab over there that speaks about polls. One of the polls, if you take a look at that, there's a poll over there that's asking your opinion to a specific question. That question is, what, in 1 or 2 words, are the essential components of a livelihoods program to build climate resilience for the poor? If you could enter in right now a few key terms that you consider to be the real key components of such a livelihoods program, building climate resilience for the poor, please go ahead right now. So just to remind everybody, that poll is on the Pathable page for this session. And once you've entered in a couple of words that as you see them, then you can hit the enter button.
Thank you very much, Anton. Hello, everybody. First of all, welcome to all our participants and welcome to all our speakers. Thank you to everyone who has joined, and thank you for the opening remarks, Anton. My name is Hannah. I'll be the moderator and co-host for today's session. To let everybody know, the session will run in 2 parts. In the first part, we have a set of videos and live presentations, and then we will move into a panel discussion and attendee Q&A in the second part. To kick off the session, we'll start with an opening video. This video outlines how livelihoods are being integrated into the Zambezi strategic plan. Thereafter, we'll show a quick share of the results of our first poll, which I can see is rapidly being populated. So thank you to all participants for that. And so to kick off, we'll start with this first video. Thank you, Charles.
The Zambezi watercourse is Africa's 4th largest, spanning the 8 Zambezi riparian states and home to over 45 million people. The area in question centers on the 2,500-kilometer journey of the Zambezi and its tributaries. In 2004, Angola, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia and Zimbabwe collaborated to form the Zambezi Watercourse Commission, or ZAMCOM.
We are a watercourse that looks at the collection of all waters within the geographical location that drains towards one point. And we also include, we pay special attention to issues related to groundwater.
As ZAMCOM, we recognize the obligation to sustainably manage our common water resources. These resources must promote economic growth for the people of the Zambezi watercourse and beyond, to overcome poverty, aid livelihoods, and manage the region's environmental diversity. 44% of the watercourse's population live below the poverty line. 65% of the rural population depend on rain-fed agriculture. As rains become more erratic due to climate change, people's prospects for sustainable economic growth are affected. By taking care of the environment and the water-related resources, ZAMCOM is able to look after people, reduce poverty, and contribute to a growing economy. Our strategic plan inspires members to collaborate in our vision to achieve the future that maximizes economic benefits of water development, addresses issues such as land degradation, competing water uses, and deficits in water infrastructure. The plan has 4 pillars: infrastructure investment, livelihood support, environmental protection and utilization, and water resources management. To implement the plan, we work with like-minded organizations such as CRIDIF, which facilitated the development of our livelihoods component and the vulnerability hotspot assessment. This focus is on more equitably improving rural livelihoods and resilience in a sustainable way, while reducing siltation and land degradation. By carefully weighing people's needs, our approach prioritizes areas for livelihoods interventions to overcome poverty and sustainably use our water and natural resources. This approach follows a step-by-step process. In the first step, we develop a number of maps of the watercourse using different lenses. These different lenses, environmental, social, political, climatic, and economic, show us different levels and areas of stress. When these are examined together, it is easier to see potential high-risk areas or hotspots. These areas are then prioritized and taken into the second step. This step ensures our data reflects the reality on the ground. We consult the people who know this best, those living in the affected communities. Through these facilitated workshops, we gain insights into the many ways water is used, for example, in the environment, in irrigation, in aquaculture and farming, and in the generation of energy. These sessions guide us to answer important questions such as why these areas are vulnerable, who the most vulnerable are, and to better understand which types of interventions might address the challenges. This approach forms a foundation for building an inclusive community and stakeholder-owned solution. By participating in developing the solution, stakeholders are more likely to own and drive the implementation. Plans are underway to design and mobilize a livelihood support financial investment program. This will support the implementation of a wide range of interventions to improve equitable water access for both households and industrial use. For example, by noting differences in water usage between rural, urban, and peri-urban areas, we can introduce appropriate pay-for-use practices and governance structures. In agriculture, where 97% of the crops are rain-fed, we are working to implement rainwater harvesting, develop a small-scale water irrigation and storage, facilitate market access for smallhold farmers, and introduce climate-smart practices. In supporting environmental management, we are promoting practices to reduce flooding and silting and to increase the recharge of groundwater. In promoting energy sustainability, we are working to implement solar-powered programs for livelihoods and household use, as well as small-scale hydropower generation. These solutions reduce the use of carbon-based fuels like wood, while promoting soil conservation and reducing sediment buildup. Through our partnership with CRIDIF, we are fulfilling our mandate.
CRIDIF has been a very strategic partner, so to speak, in that it is very focused on helping ZAMCOM deliver tangible outputs that can make a difference and from which you can learn.
By enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening institutional foundations, and promoting equitable and reasonable use of our shared water resource, as well as promoting efficient management and sustainable development of these resources. Together, we will build the resilience of the Zambezi watercourse for both its people and the vital ecosystems on which they depend.
Thank you very much, Charles, for sharing that interesting video. While you're sharing your screen, if you could bring up the results of the poll. It's interesting to see the answers coming through. We can reflect briefly on what participants are feeling are the most important components to build a livelihoods program. Thanks, Charles. So as we can see, participation, very important when we're building livelihoods programs. Clearly the most important opinions and insights to include are those people whose livelihoods we are creating the program for. Security and safety, water. Thanks everyone for your inputs. Next, I'm going to invite Caroline Salek to share her screen. Caroline is going to give us a presentation on the use of vulnerability mapping and hotspot identification to guide the development of livelihood interventions. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and greetings, everyone. Following the video on our work in the Zambezi, I'm now going to be sharing some insight into Okavango River Basin, with a particular focus on the use of extensive stakeholder engagement to complement. Since 2017, CRITIV has worked with the Okavango River Basin Commission to design and implement livelihood projects in Angola, Botswana, and Namibia. Communities in these countries face a range of challenges similar to those in the Zambezi video you just saw, which include social, environmental, climatic, and political risks. And they too require support to enhance their resilience to these external shocks and stresses. To identify these livelihood projects, we applied the same approaches in the Zambezi, which combined socioeconomic, environmental, and climate GIS data with citizen science. Our initial desk-based approach resulted in the development of this map, which indicates areas that were exposed to both hazards, such as floods, droughts, and diseases, as well as where compounding livelihood-related vulnerabilities existed. And we termed these areas hotspots. While this initial analysis provided a use, we knew that this information was largely static. It was not at a granular community scale and did not capture the dynamic nature of basin development. We knew that until we had this more detailed level of information, we'd not be in a position to begin conceptualizing livelihood projects that would improve specific communities' resilience. We therefore embarked on a process of conducting in-depth consultations with stakeholders who live and work in the basin, as well as climate scientists, sociologists, and various levels of government. The coming together of these different groups who typically do not engage with and discuss livelihood issues and make decisions around them required an interactive approach that allowed for balanced sharing of information. A fundamental starting point for these discussions was the unpacking of key concepts, such as livelihoods, hazard, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. Once we'd converged on the meaning of these key terms, we proceeded with interactive group work mapping exercises. Given the groups consisted of different genders, ages, social hierarchies, cultures, and languages, we found that group work discussions were most conducive when centered around map visuals. Participants were divided into groups and tasked with locating drivers that influence the economic, social, and environmental welfare of their livelihoods. Then they needed to determine whether these drivers were hazards or vulnerabilities. And finally, they identified where these hazards and vulnerabilities compounded in a single geographic area, which we then considered a hotspot. It was encouraging to learn that the hotspots identified by the stakeholders were closely aligned to those that had previously come out of the desk-based map work. It was important to note, however, that the stakeholders provided much more depth to the descriptions that characterized the hotspots, which in turn led to the design of more targeted project responses. This photograph is an example of the types of maps that were generated through group work. You'll see that the colorful stickers were used to indicate different types of hazards and vulnerabilities, and where they're clustered together, they indicated potential hotspot areas. The The outcomes of this work in Angola, Botswana, and Namibia was used to generate this hotspot map, which is accompanied with written hotspot characterizations in all 6 areas. I've highlighted some of the issues covered in these written characterizations for 2 hotspots, one in Angola and one that is on the border of Angola and Namibia. And you'll see some of the types of issues we saw were land degradation, malnutrition, risk of landmines, poorly serviced wash facilities, high incidence of human-wildlife conflict, as well as gender-based violence, etc. These community engagements had the threefold benefit of extracting stakeholder knowledge and perspectives in a discursive and engaged manner, building national capacity around key climate concepts, and garnering consensus and ownership on the approach and its resultant outcomes. And this buy-in was really the most fundamental aspect of the process, given the hotspot map is considered a living tool, both by the Okavango River Basin Commission and its partners. And as the circumstances in the basin evolve and more information becomes available, this map can be updated, refined, and used. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thanks for sharing a practical way to make participation a cornerstone of any livelihoods program. To follow, we have a video on livelihoods and climate resilience support in the Okavango River Basin. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles. Now to give a little bit more information about the Okavango River Basin Fund, its development and how it's moving towards operationalization. Join me in welcoming Sekgoa Motsumi from the Nature Conservancy. Thanks, Sekgoa.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and greetings to you all. At the Nature Conservancy, we are very happy to be part of this important session about livelihoods and climate resilience. At the Conservancy, we aim to create sustainable mechanisms for local people to benefit from improved resource management. And in doing so, we reduce poverty and conserve biodiversity. And we do this by creating innovative on-the-ground solutions to the world's challenges so that nature and people can have together. This presentation that I'm going to give just builds on the work that Caroline has just sort of presented in her presentation. If you can go to the next slide, Charles. So if to contextualize the Okavango Basin, it represents a complex socio-ecological system to which ecosystem health and resilience is central. Presently, with the broader context of climate change, the impact of unregulated natural resource harvesting, as well as such as overfishing and overharvesting of other natural resources. You situate that within the broader context of climate change. The impact of unregulated natural resource harvesting, as well as rapid rural population growth, will contribute to large-scale ecological degradation in the basin. This will obviously then, diminish the ability of the river system to deliver the crucial ecosystem goods and services. on which the basin's 1 million residents and the member states of Angola, Botswana, and Namibia are dependent on. And therefore, based on what the current just presented on some of those sort of hotspots and livelihood issues, if current degradation and impacts continues, the river basin is likely to experience increasing degradation of natural resource base, and in particular, the water resources. And in turn, agricultural and natural based livelihoods will become more compromised. So if we can move to the next slide, Charles. So as a response to these challenges, OCACOM and its partners, developed a COP fund. As you know, COP fund is just one of the many instruments available to manage resources. And the fund was established as a tool to distribute resources from an independent endowment and sinking fund to implement targeted interventions to conserve and restore biodiversity, as well as important ecosystem functions in the basin. Livelihoods are critical to this, and therefore, equitable and socially just livelihoods in the basin are quite as important. Next slide. In establishing the fund, the member state, made sure that its governance structure is informed by international best practice that balances ownership and independence. The board of directors, for example, if you see in the slide, is comprised of 7 board members, out of which 4 are independent and 3 represent the member states. In terms of its structuring, it's a hybrid fund with both a sinking and endowment component, targeting about $250 million worth of capitalization for its endowment component, an initial sinking fund of about $15 million US dollars. Next slide, Charles. We, STNC, supported this process by bringing in the science and knowledge to develop a value proposition or a business case to support this process, so that we can demonstrate the economic case for investing in nature-based solutions and people-centered livelihoods improvement activities. The value proposition study evaluated the net benefits and return on investment generated through investing in conservation-oriented development interventions. In this case, we looked at the 2 scenarios, a resilient development scenario and a business as usual. So we are comparing the benefits that will accrue if we follow the current trajectory or follow what we call a resilient development scenario. Next slide, Charles. So what is coming out of this analysis, is that over a 30-year period of analysis, if we implement this type of interventions that are articulated about sustainable forestry, wildlife, conservation, agriculture, sustainable fishery. So, next slide. So the analysis indicates, therefore, that the fund's livelihood and socially focused interventions would have a combined, return on investment of 7 to 1. Meaning that for every dollar invested, the communities in the basin will accrue a benefit of $7 US. Considering that this basin, there's high levels of poverty, this is a very important investment by the countries. So the value proposition therefore demonstrates a clear economic basis for investing in rural livelihoods improvement and conservation of important freshwater systems. This will in turn, of course, protect globally important biodiversity and build more resilient communities in the face of climate change. This aligns very well to the development and conservation objectives articulated in the OCACOM strategic plan. So I thank you, moderator, for the opportunity to share what the riparian states of Angola, Botswana, and Namibia have pioneered, really to deal with one of the, in your poll questions was investment. So funding is a major issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Segoa. To close off this part of our seminar, we now have a short video on building resilient livelihoods. Thank you, Charles.
The sun beats down and your crops struggle in the overbearing heat.
Oh, sorry, Charles, the video isn't sharing.
Temperatures.
There we go. Thank you, Charles.
The sun beats down and your crops struggle in the overbearing heat. You just want relief from the rising temperatures, but your nearest water is kilometers away. Rainfall patterns have changed and the river weir has silted up. The riverbank is eroding because of overuse. There is not enough water to farm. There is not enough clean water to drink. Droughts are not just hardships, they devastate communities. The Kufandada and Bindagombe villages in the Bigita and Chivi districts of Zimbabwe are typical of many rural communities in southern Africa, where changing rainfall patterns and droughts wreak havoc on harvests, lives, and communities. To fetch water, villagers face a lengthy, time-consuming walk to the river, carrying full containers on the return trip. Most is used in the household, some is used to irrigate crops. There is little to spare for livestock or chickens, and polluted water from the river or from shallow wells causes sickness. To save time and the effort of carrying water, the villagers cultivated land closer to the river. But as a result, the riverbank eroded and siltation increased. A solution was needed to help the villagers fight climate change and to provide the villagers with a reliable water supply, to stop riverbank erosion, to decrease siltation, and to irrigate crops. Money could be raised for building and installing the pumps and pipes. But how would the communities pay for pumping the water, maintenance, and irrigation? We built on the community's strengths, linking them to an agricultural seed company. The company would provide seed, fertilizer, advice, and access to markets. The communities would provide land, skill, and labor. This allowed the farmers to cultivate their land all year, planting, harvesting, and selling. Two slightly different projects were built. Solar panels power Kufandada's pumps, while Bindagombe is linked to the national grid. The Kufandada project also provides power, vegetable gardens, and a backup water supply to the local Bigita district hospital. Since the project was completed, harvests have increased and riverbank erosion has stopped. The villagers are eating better and incidences of disease and malnutrition have decreased. The community is healthier. Farmers sell their surplus through the agricultural company, making an income. This money allows them to invest in their farms, themselves and their children. The money also allows them to contribute towards the costs of pumping and irrigation. Communities have water committees to ensure water bills are paid. The committees work with regulatory bodies and ensure that the villagers have a voice in the joint management and maintenance of the project. Access to a reliable source of water has rebuilt these communities and given villagers an income and control over their future. All of this adds to the villagers' resilience to ongoing climate change. In time, riverbank erosion, silting, and flooding will decrease. This will improve the availability of water, carrying benefits beyond the two villages into the whole river basin. Expansion of similar schemes in rural SADC would be a significant step in the fight against poverty and climate change. This has been an exciting journey to undertake together. Our thanks to all who traveled with us. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. These life-changing projects at Bindangombe and Kufandada were supported by the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility, an official SADC program funded by the UK Department for International Development. CRIDIF supports the Southern Africa Development Community to achieve the objective of development and economic growth, to alleviate poverty and enhance the standard and quality of life of the peoples of Southern Africa.
Thank you, Charles. I'm now going to launch the second poll of the seminar. So if attendees can navigate once again to the polls tab and feel free to put in your answer to the second poll throughout the panel discussion. We'll close the session reflecting on those answers. The question for the second poll is, what in your thoughts is the greatest challenge in developing livelihood programs? So we look forward to seeing your thoughts on that. I now would like to welcome all of our panel members to join our discussion today. Our panel members' bios and affiliations are on the landing page of this event. So in the interest of time, I'd ask all attendees to go and take a look at that page to see who our panelists are. I'm going to dive straight into some questions that we've put together to initiate the conversation, but please, I welcome all attendees to type questions in the Pathable chat, and we can also direct those to our panel members today. So I'm going to start with the first question, and that is, how should livelihoods programs be prepared for transboundary river basins? I'd first like to ask Tracy from ZAMCOM to respond, followed by Engineer Evans from the perspective of ZAMCOM. Thank you.
Hello, do you ask me? Because I got cut a little bit there.
Oh, sorry, Tracy. Thank you so much. We wanted to kick off the discussion with your thoughts on how we should think about livelihoods programs for transboundary river basins.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and I'm really happy to be part of the discussions of today. We've had really interesting videos and presentation in the first session. Indeed, livelihoods interventions for transboundary river basin clearly calls for an approach that goes beyond the confines of national territory. Therefore, it goes to show that it has a bigger scope, it has a wider geographical area, and it has a larger participants. And therefore, programs and interventions that it requires projects and interventions that are jointly planned and coordinated to leverage on the capacity of the resources for a bigger impact. Therefore, some of the key or important elements that one needs to consider when framing livelihood programs or interventions, firstly for me, and I think it's been really covered with the videos that we've seen just now, that there should be an inclusive participatory consultation process. This consultation should cut across all levels of governance and institutional structures. And it must be also be very, very much more gender inclusive, because with that, you'll be building rapport among entities and those that are interested. It will also ensure that there's ownership and the important part, the ultimate support for the implementation of such programs. Because it will give assessments on what is the need of the intended recipients and what would they want to have included in the program to respond to the challenges that they have. It's important that when we undertake this, it's supported by factual information around the area. We've seen on the videos about the assessments that were done in the Zambezi, that were done in the Okavango. We know we've developed a strategic development program for the Okavango, and we have the strategic plan for the ZAMCOM, which were the basis of technical and scientific information being collected around to inform such programs, of which those strategic programs are now being used to develop community intervention. Secondly, a lot of time we assume that there's social cohesion among communities. It is important really to understand the cultural, political, and social economic dynamics within the recipient area. This could be across within the national level or in transboundary levels. Therefore, when we understand these dynamics, it becomes very easy to coin programs or initiatives that are acceptable and can be uptaken by the recipients. And they go along with their cultural backgrounds and their culture and their socioeconomic livelihood, even the political frameworks within the area. So quite presented on the COP fund, and that it's one of the possible areas that are important in terms of ensuring that there's sustainability of resources. And these resources are not only financial, they're also technical. It's equipment that people use. For example, a lot of work in communities revolves around agriculture, and there's a lot of implements that are required to undertake such work. Therefore, it is important that as we frame the program, we are assured of the sustainable resources to proceed with the implementation and taking it even ahead. So platforms such as developing the COP fund, initiatives such as developing the COP fund, innovative and sustainable funding mechanisms are very key in this process. In relation to that, we also need to have platforms that we create that would support the implementation. ZAMCOM, for instance, they have created what they called stakeholder engagement platforms, who are people that are really supporting the development of the programs for communities, as well as ensuring the implementation and participation of all involved. And OCACOM, there was one of the project had developed what you call the basin-wide forum, which was a membership from the 3 countries at community level, which was very helpful in determining some of the needs and the aspirations of the communities around the basin. Lastly, I think it's important also to look into the technical capacity building. And while we do the assessment, it's important to include the understanding of the level of capacity of the recipients or the supporting institutions to implement the programs or the projects. When you do that, it helps in allowing to prepare in advance and provide for the training if may be needed, or the coaching that may be needed, or the mentoring that may be needed to implement activity. We've seen a number of projects failing because we do not anticipate that there will be capacity deficiency in terms of implementation. And I can give an example of the programs that we're doing with OCACOM for demonstration projects with the communities. One of the projects in Botswana, you've supported that implementation through the involvement of a mentor who works with the communities, works with the farmers on a day-to-day basis to mentor them, to help them to develop a process that is sustainable. And that has really yielded a lot of positive feedback, and it's building a long-term framework that the farmers themselves would be able to replicate as they go along, even when the project comes to an end. So I think for me, that's the main 3 areas that I can think of at this stage.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I think summarizing in those 3 areas really does show that there are a lot of dynamics to consider simultaneously. So thank you for that. I'd like to invite Engineer Evans to add any additional comments from the ZAMCOM perspective.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Tracy, for that response. How should livelihoods programs be prepared for transboundary river basins? From experience, They've got to be issues, challenges that are actually validated, articulated at those transboundary levels. And normally these challenges are established through very extensive stakeholder, stakeholder consultations. And we find that, these challenges are articulated not only at the basin level, but also at the SADC, the SADC level. All the countries, for example, poverty, infrastructure deficit, disaster risk, all those are issues, that are articulated. And in the frameworks that govern the activities of, for example, the Zambezi, these challenges are also articulated in these frameworks. And it is these frameworks that are shared, with partners, with organizations that also have frameworks that articulate, those particular issues. For example, at the moment, we could also talk of groundwater. It's a challenge, it's an issue, there are issues there. And so ZAMCOM, for example, SADC, CASA, we have got frameworks that actually articulate such challenges. So that is one of the key bases, for developing a program that is transboundary in nature. Transboundary in that this is also the basis for organizations to come together in the form of partnerships, because there's an interest in actually addressing that particular issue. So these are some of the, I would emphasize issues that are articulated at the transboundary, the existence of frameworks. These enable, resources to be mobilized, coming together of skills and knowledge targeted at actually addressing those particular challenges. So in a nutshell, I could just end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evans. I'm going to use what you mentioned in your last point about bringing people together and resource mobilization to introduce our next question, which is, how can funds be mobilized for transboundary basin livelihoods programs? I'm going to ask Jim to please respond to this, having worked in the space all over the world. And then I invite Tremaine from FCDO to speak from the perspective as an active funder. Thanks, Jim. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Thanks everyone for participating in this session. I think it's pretty obvious in all that we have seen so far and heard from our other members of this discussion that this is going to be a relatively expensive venture, what we're talking about here. When I look at the key points that were raised in the initial poll, talking about engaging communities' participation, building up the energy capacity and the resources to meet these challenges, this is going to be a significant financial investment. How are we ever going to get there? Well, I think we're going to find that this is going to be a fund, an independent fund that we've talked about, the Corp Fund, that is capitalized through, I guess, what we would call a blended finance structure, where we will be attracting funding from both the donor community as well as from the investment and financial community, bringing the two of those together. Certainly, we're going to be looking to the donor community to help with a lot of the initial startup funding, as well as trying to capitalize a long-term endowment to support this fund over time. But at the same time, we're talking about infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure development, and that is where I think we should see the attraction of investors who are going to want to step up, bring money to these areas, not simply to support the really noble and excellent objectives you set out here, but also to make money themselves. So I think we're going to see this combined flow from both investors, the investment community, as well as the donor community that will bring this together. And
thank you, Jim.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jim. I certainly agree. I think we're seeing huge opportunities with innovations with blended finance and increasingly creative structures. So thanks for raising that point. If Tremaine could come in from the perspective of FCDO, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks. So I was thinking about this because it's obviously a common question when you're a donor, but I mean, before I joined FCDO, I worked in the development sector for a long time. And for me, what I really think we don't always realize from the ground is that it's a function of alignment and scale. So anything that you are considering, it has to obviously make sense in the first instance, but is it part of national development plans? Is it on the radar of transboundary planning commissions? For example, ZAMCOM in their latest strategy, they identified a series of projects. They don't list them in the document, but they went through that scoping process. And that pipeline, which aligns with policy strategy, that's one of the first major steps. Second is scale. Obviously, projects can be large or they can be small, and you have to match the amount of money to the type of funding that you're seeking. You can't just go for example, the Green Climate Fund if it's a very small project. There are these asymmetries of scale, and there's probably a missing middle in the funding ecosystem as a result for these smaller localized projects. And then for me also, it's a function of outwards and inwards. So donors, especially like FCDO or USAID, they're often considered a first point of call. And a lot of our funding goes to these worldwide collective funds like the Green Climate Fund or to multilateral banks. However, I think it's especially important that one be inwards looking. So how is the domestic enabling environment? How can business operate? Is it a healthy ecosystem from that standpoint? Because fundamentally, donor funding is never going to be enough to solve all of these challenges. What we need is for things to make sense for business and for people, but neither of those makes a difference if people and business cannot operate in a stable environment. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tremaine, for that perspective. Next, I'm going to move to the ground level and ask Dr. Kabea if he can please give us his thoughts on the role of groundwater in livelihoods programs and building climate resilience. And after we've heard from Dr. Patrice Kabea from SADC, we can ask James from the Groundwater Management Institute to also respond. So over to you, Dr. Kabea. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And it's much more of a complex element in terms of groundwater. Groundwater is very essential in terms of addressing water shortages or water scarcity, which really was as a result of climate change, and which really help to supply the safe water, which is essential in terms of sustaining the livelihood of the people, especially in a number of sectors, for example, agriculture, animal husbandry, and so on. Then looking at the context of COVID, for example, groundwater also is very critical in terms of contributing to supporting the communities or the nationals in terms of continuing with the activities while trying to address the COVID-19 effect on their impact on agriculture or on animal husbandry and on their livelihood. So that's basically what I can say about groundwater. And the programming in terms of groundwater, we need to take into account or come up with a policy which are much more resilient policy make. And the programming and funding instruments should be embraced so that we don't leave anybody behind in the implementation or at the design level of those particular programs, especially coming up with priority action which support the most marginalized and which can really help those marginalized to generate revenues to develop their livelihood assets in order to deal with the issues of poverty at the regional level. So groundwater is very essential. And another element which we need to consider in terms of the role of groundwater in livelihood program is that we need to focus more on building and strengthening partnerships within the basin, for example, and between a broad range of local, national, and private actors which are involved in strengthening or supporting the livelihood interventions in the region. For example, to achieve those specific goals of attaining a sustainable livelihood program or sustainable livelihood program here. So then the programming also, those particular programs need to be actively promoted, need to demonstrate accountability. Because if there is no accountability, then there is a problem. So we need to have accountability on how our resources are distributed across the basin, for example, or across those players who are involved in terms of trying to develop those particular programs. Then ownership of those particular programs. So groundwater really play a critical role in those particular, and ensure that all the interested parties who are fully involved in designing those particular programs, so that we don't really have more suspicious, then reduce conflict, for example, at the basin level. So there are so many issues which you need to address and to deal with in defining the role of groundwater in addressing, in helping to design or to promote livelihood program in the SADC region in the context of climate resilience for the poor. So thank you very much with those particular few details. I think
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabeya. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Anna. So for groundwater in our region in SADC, for instance, is about 70% of our population depends on groundwater for their livelihoods. And that's about 75% across Africa. And as we generally know that groundwater and the poverty and the environment are almost always interlinked. So the dependence on groundwater dependent ecosystems is also quite high in our region. Therefore, it is very important that we manage groundwater efficiently. Our region is the economy of our region is about the GDP. 9% of that comes from agriculture, of which about 83% of our water resources go to agriculture, whereby groundwater contributes about 12%. As a region, we are still using about 1.5% of the available renewable groundwater resources that we have. And at the same time, we need to enhance food and water security. So we have a big gap or a big potential to exploit the available groundwater resources to support the livelihoods of our communities within the region. So in a nutshell, that's the very important role that groundwater plays to enhance the livelihoods of our communities. And we have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. It really highlights how dynamic we need to be when dealing with livelihoods programs, especially in the African context where so many livelihoods are resource-based. So thank you both Dr. Kabeya and James for illustrating that example with groundwater. Another key point on that is ecosystem integrity to ensure that resource-based livelihoods can remain sustainable. So I'd really like to ask Steve Collins to speak to us about the role of nature-based solutions to improve ecosystem integrity for livelihoods programs. And linked to this question, I'd like to get Steve's thoughts and possibly Sekgo's thoughts on one of the questions coming from the attendees, which is how we determine environmental flows for biodiversity protection. So Steve, over to you, if you could speak to us about nature-based solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to CRIDA for inviting us to be part of this. So I'll leave the measure of the environmental flows to the experts, so Sekgo can answer that. But just in terms of the issue of ecosystem services, I think what you need to understand is in the basins that we are working in within Southern Africa, the rural people are dependent on the existing ecosystem services they are getting from those environments. And the clash often happens with animals where there's competition, for example, around water. So I think we also know that in the long term, what we should be doing is increasing the ecosystem's capacity to deliver those services. So what we're really looking for is a development path for these communities which are dependent on these resources to live a better life, but be part of managing the resources. I think what's important, and there's a lot of discussion about participation, we're talking about transboundary, we're talking about transcolonial boundaries here. And what the days of telling people what to do because we think it's correct are completely over. So we've got to involve people in those decisions. And as soon as you start talking to them about the natural environment, they know because they're living with those environments. So I think they'll be happy to support looking after them, and they'll be happy to do what they can as long as they are enabled to live a good quality life. And that's where these interventions we talk about are coming in at. So we can certainly involve them in doing work around ecosystems, but we've got to find a better development path for these communities that is low carbon and works with the communities. I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much, Hannah.
Thanks very much, Steve. Segoe, if you may please help us with the response to one of our attendee questions on environmental flows and how we undertake that research toward biodiversity protection. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah. Very briefly, just to say that when we did the business case or the value proposition work, it was dependent a lot on hydrological modeling work that included both catchment or land use management activities and in-stream hydrology. And the issue of environmental flows played a major role and, of course, very critical. And it's one of the reasons, of course, why we do this type of hydrological modeling to make sure that all different uses can be considered and accommodated in how the catchment is managed. And it formed a major part of the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Segoe. Yes, there's a lot of detail behind that. So you're welcome. I believe the question is from Wesley. You're welcome to look at some of the resources that have been produced on the Call Fund for more detail on that question. Well, we've come to the end of our session, and in the last minute, I would just like to, first of all, thank everyone for the participation. It's been a very full session with lots of wisdom and experience shared. So thank you to everyone. Charles is displaying the results of our last poll, which highlight what people are feeling are the greatest challenges for developing livelihoods programs. It's clear that there's a lot going on between lots of different partners, and so coordination between all institutions and people involved is key. And secondly, really understanding and identifying those vulnerabilities and defining interventions based on those. So getting that first-hand perspective from basin residents, from beneficiaries of livelihoods programs is absolutely essential. And the participation of those people is critical for the design of livelihoods programs. And then, of course, accessing funding is always going to be a challenge, but hopefully with innovations in blended finance, more and more people seeking to manage their money through impact investing, I think we're going to see more and more capital unlocked with the purpose of having a social and environmental impact, as well as generating financial returns. So thank you very much to everybody. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your afternoon or morning or day, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining us today.